That's what I think people should learn. And you're just thinking to yourself, that's not the answer. That's telling a sexual assault victim, hey, well, what did you expect? You know that you shouldn't walk home alone at night, right?
Yeah.
Hey, you shouldn't be wearing such a short skirt. Of course you get sexually assaulted. That is not the answer. That we have to work on the narrative shift between blaming victims of sexual violence, image-based sexual abuse included, for their assault.
Whether you're aware or not, narratives permeate our identities, defining what we know. Over time, they can harden into convictions and legacies, driving cultures, politics, economics, and consciousness. But how are they made? Where do they come from? And more importantly, which ones shape our thoughts and feelings now? Welcome to Narrative Dive, where we uncover the tropes, news, and stories dominating our world. Thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Welcome back to Narrative Dive, where we are deep diving into the stories dominating our world. Today, we are tackling a very important subject, and that is intimate privacy in the digital age and technology-facilitated abuse. So what do I mean by this? Technology has always been somewhat of an adversary to women, despite its advantages. And I could go back through all of the dimensions of human history as to how every technological advancement has somehow worked against women or not served us. But I want to, in this particular context, start with the late 80s into the 90s, when we started seeing this phenomenon known as the celebrity sex tape. And much of this started with Pamela Anderson and her husband, Tommy Lee, at the time, where intimate video was stolen from their home and released to the public. In the 2000s, the social media revolution and search engines came into play and created forest fire ways to spread information and intimate images globally within seconds, which means that anyone who wanted to put images of you online could easily do it, and still can, but to higher dimensions now. We've become familiarized and socialized with the term in the last 10 years or so known as revenge porn. And this is the distribution of sexually explicit images or videos of individuals without their consent. Now, these individuals largely being women, although there are some other cases where they are not. The purpose behind this is that it is a punitive intention to humiliate and assassinate the character of the victim. Often what has happened is that it is the former intimate partner of the victim, or in some cases, as we're about to talk about, it is a woman running for political office or a thought leader who is demeaned by adversaries in order to be taken from the higher level position in society that she's worked very hard to obtain. And now AI is taking over. In 2023, in a small southern Spanish town, AI-generated images of young local schoolgirls began circulating on social media without their knowledge. Now, these images were taken from real images from their social media, clothed images of the girls. They were then processed by an application that generates an imagined image of a person without clothes on. From what we know, more than 20 of these girls were affected under the age of 18. So this incident started a massive global conversation on the harms when you apply AI generating capabilities to a platform or to revenge porn, what this can do and the harm that it can perpetuate. With me today in this discussion are two very important leaders in not only passing legislation, but getting the message out as to why these harms are so pervasive in society and what we're facing if we don't do something about this now. Welcome, Susanna.
Of course. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to speak about it with you.
And then we have Miss Andrea Powell.
Thank you for having me, Jessica.
Absolutely. So One of the reasons I wanted to bring this subject to Narrative Dive, we are a show about narratives, of course. So we are going to be going into the important subject matter, but we're also going to be deep diving into some of the narratives that victims are told that don't necessarily help them get what they need from law enforcement, from the community, to prevent further detriment to their reputation and to clean up what has already been put out there. And so we want to call attention to that, dispel them, and give anyone who comes face to face with this ordeal a way to help themselves. So how I personally got into this arena was rather inadvertent. And I want to share this as a prelude. About 7 years ago, I got heavily into the virtual reality space. Now, virtual reality, as many of you may remember, was a booming, new, exciting frontier back in 2016, circa 2016. And I was in San Francisco at the time, attending all of the events. We had some of the leaders in the industry, women leaders at that, who'd been around for 20 plus years in gaming, in many different arenas, and they were teaching classes, convening gatherings. And I remember several of the gaming companies were even hosting free gatherings in their offices. So this was an exciting time for journalists as well and content creators like myself. And one of the things that came to my attention during some of these meetings was the women complaining about the abuse they were sustaining in some of these very nascent VR worlds. Now, we are talking basic stuff here, like a simple stick avatar, not the photorealistic stuff that exists now. This was conceptual type things, but these women were talking about how there were actions being done to them that in the real world would hopefully, not in all countries, but get someone arrested. And these were groping their chest area, groping private areas, inserting the gaming controller into a private area. Several of the women reported having to end their experience as a result of these abuses. And I remember having a deep think about this, going, okay, I'm a journalist. This is a story that needs to be told. And I went to my editor at Reveal, Center for Investigative Reporting, used to be the name of the organization. And I told the editor I was working with at the time, hey, this story really needs to be told. Here's a memo. Here's why we need to tell it. And he immediately agreed with me. The amount of attorneys that I reached out to for intellectual property to get comment were not very helpful. One of them even laughed at me and asked me if I was writing a Ray Bradbury novel. And I went in circles. Yes, because, we've all heard these things around this issue from one point or another. And I went around in circles until someone had referred me to a woman named Mary Ann Franks, who now is a prominent legal scholar in this space and has published and written significantly about it, draft legislation, everything. And she wrote an academic paper called Unwilling Avatars that describes in most of its parts how women are projected into internet spaces as these avatar-like figures and then go through the systemic abuse that we see in the real world. And so finding her was like finding a beacon of light. And that story took 2 years to report because 2 big sexual harassment lawsuits threatened to cripple 2 of the biggest AR and VR companies at the time, Magic Leap and Upload VR. And it was quite a wild ride, but seeing the damage that it was doing to women on these platforms, seeing how it was canceling their experience made me be very persistent. And in the amount of research I did, I realized that every step of our journey online has largely been these abuses. And it brings me back to the schoolgirls dealing with the AI deepfakes. I mean, these are underage girls under the age of 18 who are also now have intimate images of them online that aren't even them, and that who knows what would have to take them down. So we kind of touched on this, but I wanted to go deeper on this. What is the impact to women who experience this and men, to anyone who falls victim to this practice?
God, I mean, it's life-changing. It's life-shattering. It is absolutely devastating and changes the way you walk around in the world. Professor Claire McGlynn published a study, and one of the things that she says in there that really touched me when I read it was that it alters your sense of self and you delineate yourself in a before and a after because of the significant rupture that it has on your identity and on your world. And that rings very true to me in my experience. Um, when you're talking about the impact it has on victims, 90% of victims have severe mental health and psychological consequences. 50%, which I found particularly alarming, half of victims contemplate suicide. About 50% are stalked online and 40% are stalked offline. Many are doxxed. Many experience breakdown of relationships and social isolation, and many lose their jobs and have trouble finding and securing new jobs. And I think almost all of those ring true for me. So I was stalked. I had to leave the state to get people to leave my home because they were scaring my children. I've been doxxed multiple times. Still to this day, if I leave the comments open on my Twitter or whatever it may be, any kind of social media post, there's almost inevitably reposting of non-consensual images of me or victim blaming and shaming. I lost my job as a nurse practitioner, and I'm a great nurse practitioner, and had difficulty finding a new job. And so, I mean, really, I think it has ripple consequences, not just to victims, but to their families and everyone in their orbit as well. Has economic consequences, takes women out of the workforce, largely women, right? 90% of victims of NDII, non-consensual distribution victim images, are women. And so, yeah, it is just absolutely horrific. And I think the permanency and the constancy, these images are going to last forever, right? Is devastating. And every sharing of non-consensual images of someone is just another cut and just another violation of consent.
Thanks, Susanna. And Andrea, you have decades in this space. Can you give us some history from your perspective, looking back as to how this started?
I think I want to take our listeners today a little further back than maybe you intended to, but I'll move fast. When I was in 6th grade, I would walk to the library every day because I was a nerd, and I would hide in the stacks. And I found a copy of a biography of Marilyn Monroe. And like every girl, I worshipped Marilyn Monroe. And I got to know her story, and there's a lot to that. But at the end of the book, the last photo was her dead on the autopsy table. And I found the other 2 copies of the book, and I ripped the page out of all 3. And I went to the librarian and committed, I confessed my crime, and she quietly just threw the pages away. Fast forward a few years ago, as I transitioned from working with survivors of sex trafficking whose images were used to sell them and facilitate their rape, I again found myself thinking of Marilyn Monroe. And what I discovered is that devastatingly poor, a trafficking victim herself, she got $50 to make nude photos. The photographer had her sign a contract. He would never share them. Insert Hugh Hefner. He bought them for around the $500 range. And he became a billionaire at the expense of Marilyn Monroe, who never saw a dime. Subsequently, she would go to parties, events, and men would rip her clothes off, mock her, film her. And this went on until her death. And while this was not the internet, it was non-consensual intimate image abuse. It was rape. And fast forward, you enter into what happened to Pamela Anderson. Those listening, please read her autobiography. It's phenomenal. It really unpacks the issues. So I was aware of these things as a young person. And then my own experience as an adolescent, I was 14. I was able to hide what happened to me. And I never saw hiding my own sexual assault as a privilege. But in meeting so many survivors of sex trafficking and image-based sexual violence, I realized in some twisted, dark way it was. I got to choose to be quiet and only recently have stepped forward a little bit. But what really strikes me are 3 things of impact. One is that this is not just one a-hole, and if I'm not allowed to curse, in a room thinking I'm going to take advantage of this woman, or I'm going to take advantage of a group of women. It is a culture. It is a culture that has gone unmitigated by law enforcement, unmitigated by policy and law until very recently. And we still don't have a federal law, which we'll get into soon. And it also is a culture that is yet to be taken seriously in any deep, meaningful way across technology. There are advances, and I'll speak to that later with Meta and some others who are doing some good things, but it's sort of like fighting needles in haystacks. And I think, as a society, we've reached this inflection point of, are we going to say that our digital lives do not connect to our offline lives? And thus what we do to women and girls online has no impact with their offline lives, which is not true. Or are we going to see this as a continuum of violence against women that is not new, but is facilitated by new technology? And so that, as I'm thinking about working alongside survivors across tech, across policy, I keep going back to that moment where I started to realize that this isn't just an image. This isn't just a video. This is actually technology facilitated rape online, or as a South Korean colleagues of mine say, it's a digital sex crime. It is. And I think until we really understand that, this culture will grow and continue.
Wow. Yeah, that is profound. That's how I see it as well. And my next question that I had was for Susanna, because I know that this happened to you and caught you particularly by surprise. While you were seeing a patient, you got a call. Can you tell us a bit about this if you're willing to share this?
Yeah. I mean, just to piggyback off of what Andrea just was speaking to, I mean, this is sexual violence. And what I experienced and the way I was treated by people who were supportive of me, in addition to people who were critics of me, it reflects that society just has no understanding of the profound impact it has on victims. So essentially, in a nutshell, just to keep it brief, what happened to me was several years prior, my husband and I had been having marriage trouble, and he essentially came to me and said he had this fantasy of us having sex and someone watching, and that he had found this streaming site that was supposed to be safe and no one could record you and all of these things. He had already created an account, and it was something that he wanted to do. And I, working on my marriage, we're actually divorcing right now. So it's been going on for a while, but I said, okay, right? Because that's what you do when your partner comes to you and you're trying to make sure and work on your relationship and your bond. And very much naive, I think, in the world of how the internet works. No, I'm no longer, but I said, okay, and tried it a few times, wasn't for me, and we stopped. But unbeknownst to me, it had been recorded by technology. It's a type of bot that recorded it and automatically uploaded it to a pirate website. And what happens with these pirate websites is there's one video that gets chopped up and then put up there multiple times. So there's a 2-minute video of me and a 4-minute video of me and a 3, and so it's multiple videos on one site. And I never knew this happened. I actually had tried to look for these images before I decided to run for office, which I never wanted to be in politics. I'm a nurse practitioner and just care a lot about healthcare policy and about abortion. And here in Virginia, this seat that I happen to live in, and the district I lived in, was an open seat. There was no incumbent, and really looked at as the majority maker or breaker for the House of Delegates here in Virginia. And I just decided that a nurse practitioner, mom of 2, would be who could win it. And threw my hat in the ring, looked for these images just to triple check, asked my husband to multiple times, had no idea. And then what happened was a reporter contacted one of my media consultants who they had relationships, years and years back, and said that she really wanted my number. And this particular reporter was a young woman, a young mother, and she wouldn't tell my consultant why she wanted to speak with me. And she just told him, I'm not going after her. She's a mother. Like I just need to talk to her. I'm not telling you why. And they went back and forth for the better part of an hour until finally I had to write something and send it to him just to say, hey, you can tell him anything and everything. And when he told me, called me back about an hour ago, I stepped out of clinic. And when he told me, I mean, to find out that there are intimate images of you and recordings of you is so profoundly violating and such a significant violation of consent and bodily autonomy. And I think that people really don't understand that non-consensual distribution of intimate images, creation and distribution is sexual violence. And there have been several studies that actually show that the impact on victim survivors is the same as the impact on survivors of sexual assault. And, you know, it was absolutely horrific. And that particular reporter was a young woman, and she was kind enough to tell us where those links were. And I thought there were just 3 links, again, very naive to the world of non-consensual pornography and user uploaded pornography sites. And I figured out how to get them taken down and thought it was over until the Washington Post reporter came 2 days later to a Canvas launch where I was, and insisted on writing a story about it, and wrote a very misleading story that essentially drew a roadmap to people finding these recordings and then distributing them on a global level. The article came out about 3:00, and later that evening, Twitter X, actually, they chose to black out and shut down for a bit to scrub their platform of these images as much as they could, because no other content could get through. So one tweet, one post of an intimate image of me had 5.9 million views, and that's just one. Okay, just one of these posts.
I'm very sorry that happened to you. That is devastating, and I commend you for getting those taken down. Are they still out there? It's because once they're on one site, they're on 5. And I think most people, when they consider this issue, don't realize just how easy it is to replicate things on the internet nowadays.
That's right. You're playing whack-a-mole, unfortunately. And, this is one of the things I think about is I had someone reach out, one of the best in the country at doing this, one of the best in the world at getting non-consensual content removed, filing DMCA takedown requests. And he has been absolutely like my guardian angel. But I think to myself, I'm a white, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, upper middle class woman who is friends and has good relationships with several lawmakers, most lawmakers in a state. And even I can't get this taken down, right? And so what about people who don't have nearly the privilege I do?
Well, Andrea, regarding her experience and the women you've worked with, have they had similar experiences where their content ends up multiple places very quickly, like wildfire?
Yeah, I wanted to kind of elaborate on that, but I wanted to start with something that leads into that. So I had in fall of 2023 read about what was happening to Susanna. And I think within an hour, I'd reached out to a mutual colleague, Katie Hill, former representative from California. I was like, Katie, you have to find her and tell her she's not alone. You have to give her this phone number, this lawyer, Carrie Goldberg. You have to give her my number, please. And she's like, I've already got you. I'm talking to her. I was like, okay. But then I, spent some time thinking about how we could, connect because but this is the thing. You see this enough times as I have, and you know the pain, the devastation, the ripple effect. That there's more than this going on than just a piece of content or an image or a video being abused. So I'm going to age myself in my 40s. But when I was in junior high, I was in the nurse's office. I didn't feel good. I was laying down and there was this poster on the wall about HIV/AIDS, right? And it showed how, like, if you had sex with one person, and they had AIDS, and it showed this ripple effect. And by the end of the poster, like millions of people had HIV. And I remember thinking, wow, like that's really like putting the blame on someone who's going through something. And it was a, different story, different scenario. But now you're seeing like what's happening online is like, there's this very kind of shame, Susanna once said to me, princess lost her crown kind of like approach. And my colleague, Electo AI, who herself is a survivor of child sexual abuse online, non-synthetic content abuse, deepfake abuse, all the things, last year before she was going to run in a New York Times piece that we had been working on together, we thought it'd be a good idea to see if there was any remaining content out there. She'd gotten most of it down by her own volition. There were over 800 individual URLs of her abuse content. We were told by the FBI at that time to leave the content up there so they could investigate. And my thought was, there's just got to be a better way. Like, I think there's this thing called hashing. But anyway, that was what we were told. Then we tried to go to 2 different hotlines, one that it worked with children, one that was allegedly working with adults, and both told us they couldn't help for different legal, logistical reasons. So we ended up going to France to work with colleagues there. We got all of the content down except for a few weird Russian URLs, and no offense, Russia, but the URLs were weird, not you. And then also 142 URLs from Microsoft Azure. This organization, Point of Contact in France, is a known flagger for a variety of tech platforms. Microsoft is a partner to an initiative called Stop NCII, that focuses on hashing and image abuse. I have connections to Microsoft. I'm in meetings with their heads of safety at the White House. So all these things keep happening. I'm like, why can't we get this down? 10 months later, we finally found the head of public policy there at Microsoft, who's lovely. And I was able to physically point to my colleague, Breeze Liu, and they were able to get the content down within a couple of days. And that's great. But what that showed us, and I think this is indicative for so many cases, is again, what is the disease here? Why is it that us saying quite clearly that this is abuse content did not elicit its removal? It's not a technological problem because they were able to do it very quickly. And that again kind of speaks to this idea of like, well, is it really them? Is it really that abusive? Is it really that bad? I've had the privilege to get to know Susanna over the last year or so and just been awestruck by the resiliency, the power, the community that we've built together. But Jessica, there are so many women, teenage girls and men and boys who don't have that community. Maybe I grew up in a small Texas town and I love my community, but trust me that a lot of people there would not understand what is synthetic or not, would not understand that I didn't consent. Quite honestly, it wouldn't matter. And then translate that into a young girl living in an ISIS-controlled area of Iraq. Even if it is synthetic, her life is over. So I really think, not to get too dark here, but the gravity of the problem is vast. And I know later we'll talk about innovations and solutions and the amazing work Susanna is doing and what Electo is doing. But, Susanna's experience times 1 in 12 Americans. That's what we're looking at, according to data from CCRI. So I don't know how many of you listening have heard of a case called Girls Do Porn. It was a case that went on a few years ago. There were over 400 victims of young women and girls, mostly over the age of 18, like 18 to 20 something, but a couple of young people. And they were lured to the San Diego area, which is where I'm based. The false promises of modeling. They had no idea what was going to happen to them. And then they would be sexually assaulted and abused. It would be filmed and it would be put on the Girls Do Porn website, shared on Pornhub, shared on individual websites. It would ruin lives. I work with survivors today who've had to completely change their entire identity and have no contact with their family, friends, nobody. They erased themselves and started new. And in January last year, there was a 4chan challenge initiated by a young man in Canada to basically see how many deepfake abuse barriers he and others could circumvent to create deepfake abuse to Taylor Swift, Billie Eilish, and Ariana Grande. So that's bad enough that these women who, yes, they're super famous, but they never signed up for their names to be synonymous with what is called deepfake porn. But what is additionally horrible is that in some cases, the bodies of that were used to create this deepfake abuse were the bodies of the girls' two porn victims, despite the fact that the images had been removed in most cases. That website had been shut down. 2 months later, the two defendants were sentenced to roughly 14 years in prison here in San Diego. And I had the privilege to listen to 26 of these women share their victim impact statement, which is a statement that a victim gets to make in court to impact sentencing. And these women still had trouble speaking, had trouble standing, were very strong and resilient. However, in many cases, clearly, were struggling to exist in this earth. And what really struck me repeatedly is they all still talked about their images still being out there. And so you can have systems like Meta, platforms like Meta or X, and there's some other platforms as well that are doing innovative work. But what we really need to have is a coordinated global response that looks at this as a global crime scene. What I often say is that to this day, most women and girls and men who I know trying to gather up and identify where all of their intimate image abuse is stored, it's like asking a rape victim to create their own digital rape kit and clean up their own crime scene and be their own detective. There is no other form of sexual violence in which society says that should be the standard and norm. And so that cannot be the message that we send to individuals who experience this. It can't be the message we send to young women and girls now that we have here in the United States a much stronger avalanche of vitriol towards women and girls, in which you have young boys telling young girls in school, your body, my rights. That started online. And while that is just language, I know my little girl who's in 5th grade, I asked her about being online, and her response was, "No, mommy, that's where bad things happen to girls." And while I don't want her online, I don't want her to not be online because she's scared. Because what if being online is a gateway to fulfilling some of her dreams and goals? And I think that that's like where I'd like to close, is that intimate image abuse, both deepfake, AI, synthetic, non-synthetic, it's a virtual get back in the kitchen.
That's a great way of saying that. I was just going to say that's one of the narratives that it incites, that's underlying. Get back in the kitchen. The one we heard in the virtual reality days was just take off your headset, turn off your computer. But what was happening in those circumstances, those women had to end their whole participation in an experience, oftentimes in an environment they were participating in engineering, all because of this behavior that none of the companies thought about in advance of enough time to program a personal space bubble into, for example. And that is the issue. What are some other narratives that victims are told? If this happens to you, what does law enforcement say? Because I know that it's like, well, not our jurisdiction, or that's online, or, what was your experience, Susanna?
Well, so I hired, and again, I'm really lucky, right? I had the resources to do this, but went back and forth with the Washington Post for about 48 hours, just saying, you can't write this story. You have this, policy, a self-imposed policy that you don't identify the identities of victims of sex crimes. And they refused to look at this as a crime of sexual violence. And they decided they were going to report on it anyway. But I had the resources to hire one of the best crisis and defamation attorneys in the country to kind of fight with them for 48 hours. And after this story came out, he called the FBI and reported it. And he said in all of his cases, in all of the years, he's never had the FBI call him back. And they basically called him back and laughed at him. And the FBI agent who had called him said, your client went online and, uploaded things online, and now she's, claiming this is a crime. And, the victim blaming and shaming by a lot of law enforcement, not all. But a lot of law enforcement, but also just they're not up to date on the current laws. I was speaking with a woman who lives in Richmond that she had reached out to one of her delegates and asked to change Virginia's law on NDII. And they said, oh, well, Suzanne already doing that. Let's connect you. And so we were speaking, and her experience was her stepfather had been taking images of her and
Wow.
for years. And when she found out, she went to law enforcement. But because you couldn't see her nipples, genitals, or buttocks, they were very sexually obscene in nature. Law enforcement, and this was just a few months ago, told her that she was not protected. That wasn't actually a violation of the Virginia Criminal Code. But it actually was, because my organization, myself and two other men, we had actually worked with some of the delegates and senators that were connected with last session to amend Virginia's criminal code so that no longer do you have to show the nipples, genitals, or buttocks. It just has to be what we define in Virginia as obscene in nature. And we chose obscene because it was already defined in the Virginia code. But the point being, that law enforcement officer that told that young woman just a few months ago that was not covered and she had, no way of pursuing charges was wrong. And so I think educating law enforcement is something that's very important. I know Andrea used to do it in the sex trafficking space a lot. But I will say also, like, the victim blaming and shaming, well, don't you should never share an image of yourself. And one of the women who's very involved in Virginia politics, her daughter is an elected official here in Virginia who likely will be the next governor of Virginia. Her mother and I were particularly close, and I saw her after this. They were both pretty horrible to me when this came out. And I said, I've started this organization because women all around the country have reached out to me and said, hey, I was watching what happened to you, the way the media treated you, the way that you were kind of paraded around and victim blamed and shamed. And I don't want to run for office. I'm terrified that the same thing is going to happen to me. 90% of millennial women have taken and shared intimate images, 90%. And so these women from all around the country reached out just looking for guidance and advice. And when I'm telling this woman this, who's a big equal rights amendment advocate and feminist, she said, well, I hope that we learn from this and society learns from watching what happened to me and that we can make an impact. And she said, I hope that people watching this know that they should never trust or send an image of themselves to someone. That's what I think people should learn. And you're just thinking to yourself, that's not the answer. That's telling a sexual assault victim, hey, well, what did you expect? You know that you shouldn't walk home alone at night, right?
Yeah.
Hey, you shouldn't be wearing such a short skirt. Of course you get sexually assaulted. That is not the answer. That we have to work on the narrative shift between blaming victims of sexual violence, image-based sexual abuse included, for their assault.
Absolutely. And Andrea, I'm sure you can say a lot about victim blaming in this circumstance.
Yeah, I was thinking about something is true, and I've seen, this image online, like 100% of rapes happen because of rapists, and 100% of image-based sexual abuse happens because of abusers. That said, though, there are essentially gateways that our online lives facilitate that. And I used to counter when I would go to pick up a client at law enforcement and they would make comments like, what was she doing with him? And why didn't she realize he was going to do this? And literally, the what she was wearing kind of thing would come up a lot. And I would counter somewhat glibly, oh, well, what was he wearing? What was he doing? What did he think was going to happen to him if he trafficked a girl? You get into these kind of conversations, but I, over time, started to identify law enforcement with whom I could work more closely on cases. But it wasn't really systems change. There laws passed, vacature, which is a law in the sex trafficking arena or in the trafficking arena to vacate the records of victims. Within the context of image-based sexual abuse, we're still at such a nascent stage of the field.
Yeah.
And I'll close with this. Back 10 years ago, there was a website called Backpage.com, and their whole business model was predicated on traffickers uploading images, videos of their victims and selling them. Now, not everything that happened on Backpage.com was non-consensual or trafficking related, but 90+% of my clients aged 12 to 26 were sold on Backpage.com. So that was my, like, you can do all the data, blah, blah, you want. But that was my reality in my little tiny office in DC. And there was a young girl who was 19 who came to us who had fetal alcohol syndrome. And as a result of the facial dysplasia, if that's the right word, she looked very young. She looked a lot younger than she was. And she really wasn't mentally very competent to participate in any type of investigation. So one day she's in my office. She's literally playing with a coloring book and wearing fluffy slippers. And I see an ad with her image on Backpage.com because I used to scrub ads looking for potential victims. And I contacted law enforcement and said, probably they're using her images because they know she can't fight back and they're probably selling a minor. Well, they laughed at me. And these are cops I worked with. And about a month later, they did a raid and found the pregnant 16-year-old girl who was being sold with my client's images. And I guess I lead with that because had they listened to us and investigated that case a month earlier, my client would have possibly not experienced the level of abuse she did. And when I think about intimate image abuse and what's happened to so many women and men who I've met, but mostly women, had their images been removed sooner, had protective tools to not surface deepfake explicit websites, of which there are 9,000 at least on just Google, and over 300 free apps, you can ruin a woman's life almost immediately. And this I'm rambling a little, but I'll stop soon. Almost 100% of deepfakes are deepfake abuse of women and girls. By nature, they're non-consensual. And meanwhile, tools to identify women and girls using AI fail abysmally. So there really is this climate, this culture of disbelief that has real lasting harm. So it's not just even about victim blaming. It's like it doesn't exist at all to so many individuals. And I really applaud, certain legislators. I am speaking domestically, like Amy Klobuchar, Ted Cruz. There are others, but really individuals, John Cornyn down in Texas, and they all have their motives and reasons. And I won't get into all the various politics, but we really, see, get kind of leading into opportunities on a legislative level. But if we don't have incredible thought leaders like Susanna leading on a policy front, not only just lived experience, but now with the wherewithal and policy skills, we're going to miss the mark.
Definitely. And I wanted to get into that next because I wrote this piece a few months back about the metaverse and many of these pervasive issues and harms that we're faced with a growing metaverse. And it was about who polices the metaverse. And you basically have three actors. You have traditional law enforcement in the physical realm. You have people, good citizens on the platforms that will form coalitions within the platforms and police from within and kick out bad actors naturally. And then you have programmers who design these worlds. And so when I was looking at how many states now, or how many around the world, and we're mostly talking about domestically in the US, of course, but I do want to acknowledge that countries like Canada, Germany, Italy, Singapore, Spain, United Kingdom, they do have laws against against revenge porn. But in the United States, my understanding is that 49 out of 50 or 48 out of 50 have
49 now.
49
It was
now.
Massachusetts and South Carolina, but at the end of June, Massachusetts passed a law. So it's now South Carolina, which we happen to be working in this year.
That's actually my home state, so I hope that you can make it. we can get to 50 at that point.
Yeah,
but with these laws, and when I think back on this sort of marriage between physical laws that we have in our physical realm and things like the metaverse, or this loose concept of what is the metaverse now, how effective are they from your perspective? Is someone able to get recourse legally, and how difficult is it if they try?
Yeah. I mean, so my organization, My Own Image, we're really focused on state level legislation. Andrea touched on, there's no federal criminal code criminalizing non-consensual distribution of intimate images. There are two bills going through right now, Shield and Take It Down, that I know Andrea has been really involved in on the federal level. I've been really focused on the state level. And I think it started naturally because I had developed relationships with a lot of the Virginia legislators just running for office and them running for office as well and responding. But really understanding that for several reasons, even if, let's say, Shield or Take It Down passes, and there are federal protections, you have to find federal prosecutors willing to prosecute the crimes. And so it's still going to come down to states. And, some states have great laws and some states have absolutely terrible laws. And I will point to Pennsylvania and Arkansas as two that I'm very familiar with right now that are just absolutely terrible. So you have to be a former or current intimate partner of this person in order to break the law, right? So your former, current, or sexual partner has to be the one who distributes your images. And intent is also a big problem, and a big problem in most states. In Virginia right now, it has to be the intent to intimidate, harass, or coerce. But like in my circumstance, right, like pecuniary gain, monetary gain, power, there's so many other reasons that people do and commit these crimes. So focusing really on the state level. Also, with state legislation and changes, you can enact them significantly faster. Last December, I took CCRI's model state policy to one of the delegates I know. It got introduced a month later. It passed through both the House and the Senate with modifications and changes, which is why we're working in Virginia again this year. That passed and was signed into law July 1st, right? So I went from in 7 months from a law that was okay but could be better to a law that's significantly better. So focusing really on states. Excellent. And in South Carolina, the only state that doesn't have any law on the books, we're actually working very closely with members of the House and the Senate, as well as the Attorney General's office in South Carolina. And they have been absolutely incredible and really big champions of being able to bring South Carolina up to speed and going from the only state that doesn't have anything to being the state that has the absolute best in the country.
How effective are the current laws from your perspective at bringing justice to those who experience this?
I think it's I'll build upon the state conversation here in the U.S. That Susanna was elaborating on. It's really kind of a smorgasbord. Again, I come from the counter trafficking space. So we had the Trafficking Victims Protection Act passed in 2000, drafted by the late Senator Wellstone, but it had a real big overarching vision of, what victimization meant, what are we authorizing, what are the funds available for victim compensation. There were opportunities for redress, guidance to sentencing requirements, 20 years across the board, pretty much. Children did not have to prove force, fraud, and coercion, kind of, all of those things. Right now, on a state level, a lot of the laws focus on the intent of the abuser, and which I find like kind of crazy. Like if someone breaks in your house and law enforcement comes, they're like, "Man, did you mean to break into this house? Could you put that vase down?" No. And the same with a sexual assault. But right now, what you're looking at is someone, in most states, they're looking at the intent. They're looking at the level of harm. And in some cases, there's very low sentences. And I'm not a particularly punitive person, but if you have the proclivity to create multiple abuse images of one person or multiple people, the likelihood that you're going to do it again kind of high. And so what deters someone? I like restorative justice too, but at a certain point, it's not just about punishment. It's about preventing further harm. And on a federal level, as Susanna mentioned, there are at least 3 kind of dominant bills looking at civil redress through the Defiance Act, which has been really heralded by AOC and some partner organizations. There's the SHIELD Act, which at this point is so old that it could go to a junior high dance. It's been around for a minute.
I've heard of that one. Yes, definitely.
Yeah, it's been around the block. So, and that one doesn't cover AI, and there's nuances as to why. We are very close to get it. It's passed the Senate. It could go through the House. We're waiting on judiciary to take it up on suspension or old school it and have a vote, as my colleague said today. And then we have Take It Down. And Take It Down's really interesting. Take It Down is basically like the SHIELD Act. So it criminalizes image-based sexual abuse. It has some limited provisions for protections. It's kind of a baseline, if you will, is what we think we can get through the door. And also a way to standardize maybe some of the state level revisions, right? But what it also does is it creates a 48-hour takedown for distributed image abuse content, and it does address deepfake abuse. It does criminalize all forms of image abuse. That piece of legislation was inspired in large part by a situation down in a small community in Texas in which a boy decided to make deepfake abuse of his 14-year-old classmates, 8 girls, and the families were trying to get the content down. Snap refused. Ultimately, one young girl, child, and her mom ended up meeting with Ted Cruz. And he was so enraged that Snap wouldn't take it down that he personally interacted with Snap and the content went down. Once again, proving this is not a technologically unsolvable issue. And through that experience and others, he worked with Amy Klobuchar, who's also a co-sponsor of SHIELD, to create the Take It Down Act. And I had the honor of testifying at a Dallas field hearing in June. And the energy of these teenage girls and their moms is so beautiful, contagious, and ferocious. But I really wish they could go back to playing soccer or thinking about school dances and not worrying if I wear a strapless dress to my homecoming dance, will I turn into a deepfake porn star?
Exactly. Yeah.
No kid should have to think about that. So, these 3 pieces of legislation, I think, have a shot. And I think we're at this point where, we have to, like on a legislative level, on a country level, I want to ask all legislators, like, do you take sexual violence against women and girls seriously? And probably the answer would be yes. Okay, if that's true, then wouldn't it also be true that you would take it seriously when it is facilitated, not happening, when it's facilitated through technology? Because technology is not out there thinking something like, I'm going to do this and do that. Technology is just a tool. It's individuals who have found a new way to violate women and girls. And until they are held accountable and until the tools are taken away from them, they're going to continue to do it. And so I think that's where we're at as this inflection point. As this society, are we going to stop this? Or are we going to say it's an inevitable byproduct of our online lives?
That's absolutely true. Yeah. And getting to this very practical point before we dive into my unpack, and believe me, because I did want to ask each of you some important questions about those. If I wake up tomorrow and I see what Susanna saw, or I get a call that there's images of you online, what do I do? What's my next step? I want to give anyone listening to this, because presumably at some point, someone who experiences this will probably find this episode. And how can we give them some action steps to take from the very beginning to help themselves?
In my experience, no one knew how to help me. No one knew what to do. And I mean, I had some of the best consultants, political consultants on the East Coast, and no one knew what to do. And I think because my experience was something that never happened before, including the best crisis and defamation attorney, right? Like no one knew what to do. And what I said on another recent podcast is to call me, call my own image, because I think there are certain steps, and we're working on creating something for our website that really walks victims through that. So step by step, but also listing resources that are trusted, because there are a lot of bad actors out there who will say that they will help you get your images removed for X amount of dollars, and you pay them, and these women will pay them. And then nothing really happens. And so being able to trust the people to help you and know who is a trusted and reliable resource is important. But, you know, understanding how to file DMCA takedown requests, understanding who to go to and where to go to. I think Andrea touched on it a bit. But, you know, there's a civil right of action, right? Like, so federally already, there's a civil right of action, meaning a victim can sue someone for distributing non-consensual intimate images of them. But a lot of people don't have money for attorneys, right? You have to be able to afford hiring an attorney who will take you, unless they will take you on a contingency basis, which most of them won't for these particular types of cases. And so that leaves out a huge section of people that really need the help. So, but understanding, unfortunately, the fastest way to get images down is through a DMCA takedown request, or essentially you saying to a platform, hey, that's my content. I own that. I own that image. You are in violation of copyright law, because that is what America prioritizes as business. But that is the fastest way to get your images taken down. If you go to the very bottom, usually, of a user uploaded pornography site, that is where you'll see there's a little thing at the bottom that'll say DMCA takedown requests. And so there's also a technology called PimEyes. There's a free version and there's a paid version that you put in a picture of your face and it will pull up, not all, right, but a lot of these different sites where images of you are, so that you can kind of find them that way and then go to those sites and file DMCA takedown requests. But it is horrific and traumatizing and deeply triggering to see these images of yourself. And so I would recommend getting in contact with an organization like the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative or My Own Image or Joyful Heart Foundation, who can really connect you with people that you can trust to do that. I still can't look at a lot of mine. It's very triggering for me. I haven't watched all of my recordings, so.
I can't imagine. So I will put those resources in the comments of the audio podcast and the YouTube version as well for anyone who should need them. Hopefully you can get help. Andrea.
Yes. So kind of building off of the resource side of things and you know, what things are and should be possible. As Susanna is saying, you know, I too get folks reaching out to me, including today, who in some way, shape, or form learn about my work and the organizations I work with, and either simply want to be heard, or they're asking for help with image removal or access to mental health or legal services. And so we're starting to think about at Electo how to use the technology that has been used to abuse women for good. And so Electo AI is, as it sounds, it's using AI, but using AI to give individual users, men or women, a verified token of their face that they own and they can use to search online for their abuse content. We are in early stages, so we're not at full-fledged. Right now, we can run the search, but we need the partnerships with platforms. We need the partnerships with other search engines to really make sure that we can directly be a liaison and connect with multiple platforms instantaneously as a verified content remover. Because right now what we're hearing from platforms is like they get inundated with all this content removal requests, and a lot of it, most of it's actually not legitimate, but so they're not really capturing what is. And so, and you have these content moderators reviewing thousands and thousands and thousands of images, which is not terribly great for their mental health. And they're often outsourced, right? A lot of these bigger platforms let go of their trust and safety or their content moderators. Many survivors are relying upon nonprofit organizations that are under-resourced and underutilized. But there are emerging resources, and there is a growing community of individuals who know how to address this issue on a domestic level and on an international level. And if you are in another country, you can go to Electo AI, the foundation. It's just electoai.com. And if you download the app, there's a lot. We're growing and growing new resources for advocacy, legal help, hotlines. We're hoping to create a seamless avenue of resource development across, my own, across Joyful Heart, across a number of other organizations. But it really is something that this is both like beautiful and hard, in which repeatedly in addressing any form of gender-based violence, it's always survivors who stand the tallest in the face of their own injustice. And I think Susanna is an example of this. Breeze Liu, who's our founder at Electo AI, the company, is another example of this. And you see this time and time again. But what I hope to send out to listeners who either have experienced this, are thinking they may have experienced it, or know someone who has, is you really aren't alone. That doesn't mean it doesn't feel like crap at 2:00 in the morning, or 1 p.m. in the afternoon. It doesn't take away the pain, but feeling witness, having community is really, really powerful. And that is starting to change. Speaking to Katie Hill, she didn't have that. And at least I don't think she did. And I think that that's where we are trying to counter the harms that are happening by building a community to address this. But it does take everyone participating, from tech platforms to law and policymakers to individuals who see a woman being abused online. Don't just reshare it. Don't just ignore it. Report it.
Exactly. It's the user participation where it goes into the user governance piece as well. Anyone listening to this can be an active part of getting these kind of things removed and taken down. And in the past, when abusive images have surfaced, it was users themselves who intervened before even the platforms. So one of the things that Andrea touched on was on building community around this issue to let victims know that they are not alone, and to let anybody who feels violated by this in any way that they are not alone. What I find fascinating about my own pack is with the pervasive and deep political divides in the U.S. at the moment, you seem to have a very bipartisan approach, and you've worked with lawmakers from both sides of the equation to help this issue. Can you talk a little bit about that? I think that's fascinating that you're really bringing together two very polarized parts of the country around this issue, which is important.
Yeah, so I started a political action committee earlier last year. It's a federal hybrid PAC so that I can support candidates in every state on different levels. One of the things, and the biggest thing that we've been doing, is we created model policy for states on the non-consensual distribution of intimate images. And when I say we, it was myself. And then I have two criminal justice reform advocates and policy experts on my board who are just brilliant. And I was lucky to meet when I was running for office. And the three of us got together, understanding that the criminal justice reform community usually is concerned about creating new laws, especially new felonies, which is what we're doing. And really trying to make sure that we have the viewpoints and listen to all stakeholders when we're creating new laws, and really working with them to create this model. So with our model, we took it to a few different legislators that we knew, and or I would be connected to a survivor in Florida, just because someone wanted to connect us and build that sense of community. And the most healing thing for me has been to help other people and really know that I'm not alone. By far the most healing thing, but have ended up in random states, not really sure, kind of haphazardly, but it has been the easiest ask of legislators. I was anticipating having to everyone knows I'm a Democrat. I was the Democratic nominee, and anticipating kind of getting some pushback, but actually have been really amazed. We have Republican patrons in Arkansas, in Florida, in South Carolina, in Virginia, likely going to be in North Carolina, and then Democrats carrying it in a few of the other states we're working in. But it's not a partisan issue. And it's been really beautiful to see, this very easy. Legislators so far, for the most part, have really started to see, I think with all the media coverage and podcasts like yours, bringing attention to the fact that this is sexual violence and the profound harm it causes. It's been a significantly easier ask than I was anticipating. If there's any barrier to it, it would be that still society and legislators really don't see this as crimes of sexual violence. And so I've had a few, and very few, but a few say, well, to me, because we take a stepwise approach. So without intent, meaning 18-year-old boy that shows a picture of his girlfriend to three friends, and it doesn't go further than that. At least in Virginia, it's a class 1 misdemeanor, so up to 12 months in jail, $2,500 fine with intent. And we really flushed out intent because intent is a big problem, but flushed out intent to include pretty much any and every other scenario that there can be. With intent, it is making a new felony. So it's a felony up to 5 years in prison, $5,000 fine. After adjudication, so you get charged, convicted. After adjudication, you do it again. Well, no, now it's at 10 years in prison, $10,000 fine. And we have a hate crime enhancer on there. So if you do this because you hate women, right? Or you hate Black women, or you hate trans women. And hate crimes are very hard to prove, just for your listeners to understand. There are a few situations that I've run into personally where absolutely it would qualify, but they're hard to prove. But if you do this because you hate a protected or marginalized group or class of people, there is a hate crime enhancer on there that is 10 years in prison, $10,000 fine. I've had some legislators say, well, to me, felonies are reserved for the worst kinds of crimes like rape and like sexual assault. And this showing a bunch of naked pictures just isn't that. And I think it's because they are not seeing this as crimes of sexual violence, and they don't see the groups of incels and the violence and long-lasting severe repercussions it has on victims' lives, just like victims of sexual assault. So
definitely. And on that front, you're mentioning this repercussion. Andrea, you wrote a book, fairly new release here that we're talking about, Believe Me, where you based it on personal stories of survivors that you have worked with. I would say, based on what Susanna was explaining earlier, why are personal narratives so important in helping reveal the importance of this issue? And it seems like an easy question to answer, but it's a very loaded question.
Yeah, I never set out to write a book, although I've always liked to write. But it felt like there was one young lady who was incarcerated as a result of her trafficking, and I won't go into so much detail; it's not as relevant today. But it was the lack of belief across all systems, law enforcement. Her own attorney's best defense of her in court, her initial attorney, was, "Well, Judge, she's damaged goods." I mean, and she went to prison not even knowing herself that she was a victim, and saw a USA Today article that my organization I was featured in, and wrote me a letter and asked, am I a prostitute or a victim of sex trafficking? And I want to be really clear. Anyone who's engaged in commercial sex or the sex trade who has image abuse happen to them deserves protection, deserves support, deserves everything that a stay-at-home housewife in Utah would have. That's not relevant. But the relevancy was that this young girl had been indoctrinated into this belief by these men that she was dirty, that she was a criminal, and she was kind of used as a patsy. At the time, the state of Georgia wanted to come down hard on traffickers, so her trafficker used her phone to traffic another girl, and they sentenced her to 30 years in prison. And fast forward, a lot of the stories throughout my book, Believe Me, are centered on really convincing other people in power to believe the young ladies and women who I worked with in order to get them justice, but also to give them avenues for healing and support. And through that, understanding kind of my own background, my own story, and how that played a role into this. And as an advocate, I think Susanna feels this way too, the individuals you're working with become like a community to you, and you find kindness and beauty in very unexpected places. And some people are hardlined about that. Like and Senator Cruz knows this. We disagree on like 98% of things. And I actually said that to him. But I said 2 things we agree on is deep fake abuse is a crime, should be a crime, and it's a form of violence against women. And we also think fishing is fun. So those are our 2 points. But in reality, all other things aside, there's an ally in the new, Senator Klobuchar, who spoke at the launch of a coalition of advocates and survivors of image-based sexual abuse a year and a half ago. And she was incredible as well. So I think in this movement, we're taking allies and support where we can find it, and finding opportunities to educate, individuals like the law enforcement official who interacted with you, Susanna. I don't know if he might have been an a-hole, but he could have just been really ill-informed, or both. But I find oftentimes there's a lack of knowledge and a lack of feeling like you can do anything. Like, I would have cops tell me, and I talk about this in the book, like, well, I would help her. I would bring her to you, but I think she'll just go back out there and prostitute herself again. So if I lock her up, it teaches her a lesson. If I leave the image up there, that teaches her not to do it again. If there's all of these like narratives, of like who gets to decide, what does consent look like? And I think we're slowly getting to a place where people understand the connectivity of our digital lives and our offline lives. And that's a good step. And I'll close with this. I started really deeply working around the issues of image-based sexual abuse exclusively around May of 2022. And that was when Amber Heard's trial against Mr. Depp was ongoing in the state of Virginia. And because I have a bit of a connection to Amber, I was paying a little more close attention to things I would otherwise consider like liberty stuff. But what really struck me was in fact the incredible abuse that was kind of bucketed into three areas. One being like, Amber's a fat cow. That's mean. You're a jerk if you do that. Then there's somebody should sexually assault Amber. And then there's the deepfake abuse of her with her 2-year-old daughter. There was over 1 million tweets or X's just talking about doxing and abusing Amber. And it was in the streets. It was in coffee shops. I live in a little surf town right now. It was in the cafes. It was everywhere. And I started to think about all of those I don't know what to call them, bad bystanders, the people online who ignore, reshare, don't report. I want to live in a world in which 1 million people reported the abuse Amber experienced, not reshared it, stored it, elevated it, amplified the abuse. And I'm not speaking to the court case at all. I'm just talking about the what happened online. And I think that really, that's sort of my guiding light in thinking about how we're going to change systems. And that's what I talked about in the book, is like believing survivors is not just nice. It could actually save a life.
That's very well put. So anyone listening to this, you can play an active role in stopping this in its tracks. Instead of relying on a platform to take something down, demand that it take it down, report it. Does the victim have to report it to law enforcement? No, you can call law enforcement and say, I saw this image. This looks very problematic for someone. I just want to report it. You have an active role in all of this. Us users can be the police of the environment. So as this is a show about narratives, there is a tradition at the end where I ask anyone I interview what narratives they've challenged lately. You've mentioned some of these, but I'm going to tweak the question a little bit for each of you and say, what narrative in this arena are you actively challenging right now? Susanna.
I will again hammer home. I like to beat dead horses that this isn't just a violation of privacy. These are crimes of sexual violence, and we really need to work on understanding that.
Excellent. And Andrea?
I think building upon what Susanna is saying, everyone deserves to be safe from sexual violence. No one deserves this type of abuse online or offline. If we're not willing to walk past a woman being actively raped on the sidewalk, why are we willing to walk by what we see online? And the challenge that I'm facing, the narrative I'm looking at, is how do we build that bridge so that there is an equal level of kindness, empathy, and support and action.
Wonderful. Thank you both for being on the show and talking about this, especially Susanna. Thank you for sharing your personal story. I know that is not an easy thing to do, but if anyone's listening, I know it will make them feel less alone. We as women can fight back, and will continue to fight back in anything that happens with the technology. We can keep demanding better of the technology. technology is only as good as its users. So if the users are demanding change, then the technology will change. I'll close this with there was a story about this when I interviewed what used to be alt space VR. I'm dating myself now. This is like old school. And I remember in the beginning of alt space, they did not have a personal space bubble for anyone who came into your area to bother you or harass you or violate you. And it took them some time to actually add one. But they added the personal space bubble because of the reports of abuse happening. So anytime you see this, you have to flag it because that's how we get the technology to change. So thank you both very much. And for anyone who needs the resources, I will be putting them in the description of the audio and video versions of the podcast.